So in this video, we are going to be looking at some more properties relating to the grid container. Now, these properties are very similar to the ones we learned in Flexbox, which is actually somewhere up here where we've learned how to justify and align items in different ways. But there are very similar concepts. The only problem is some of the values and the properties themselves are actually kind of different. So we need to go ahead and look over those differences so that we can get used to interchanging these properties between the two without kind of affecting our understanding of the properties. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is going and teaching you in this video how to align and justify our items, both horizontally and vertically. So we'll start with the first one, which is very similar to Flexbox, and it is the justify content property. So just like we've learned before, this is going to justify it on kind of the horizontal axis instead of on the vertical axis. So for example, if we were to center these items, what we would do is, well, push them all to the center instead of moving them up and down. So there we go. Let's go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to go ahead and create a new property here, justify content. Now, just like with our previous property, there are three main values that are used both in our justify content property and the align content property, which we're going to learn in just a second. The only problem is in our Flexbox section, we looked at them and they did have a prefix, which are flex start and flex end. So basically, like I said, these are sort of to signify the start and end of the Flexbox, depending on what axes you're aligning your items on. But instead of adding that prefix here, we're just going to say start, end, and center instead of something like grid start or grid end. They don't use any of that prefixes. All that's included are the three main keywords. So it's a lot simpler to understand, but it is a little bit harder when you start using both Flexbox and Grid and you get the two very mixed up or confused. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to go ahead and justify the content to the center. Why don't I go ahead and do it or justify it to the end this time, just to spice things up a little bit. If I refresh the page, you can see that our template columns, and that's the keyword there, template, are ignored and everything is completely aligned to the right side of our grid. So we can also do it just like with our previous properties in our Flexbox. We can also align it to the start and do pretty much whatever we want with these. So the next value, or the next two values that we're going to use for this property, are space around and space evenly, which is a little bit different from space between. So they both work in the same way in that they create spacing between the items to give them even them out in the grid. But the only difference is on our Flexbox, we actually used space between, whereas on our grid, we're using the value space evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that here. I'm going to just go ahead and say space evenly, like that. Now if I refresh the page, you can see that although it doesn't actually show up here, maybe because of a developer error or something like that, we now have our items here spaced evenly, just like we can see here in this grid box. Now there are, remember, spaces between or before and after our first items, and that's the key word there. You can see instead of saying between, it says evenly, and pretty much what this is saying is we're actually going to space them evenly, not just put space in between them. So like I said, I talked about a lot of uses of these in the previous section, but we're not going to go over those now. So let's go ahead and try out the next value, which is space around. And when we refresh the page, you can see that this looks pretty much exactly the same. Now, of course, we don't have lots of space or room to work with here, so you're not going to see the direct impact or differences between these. So for now, let's just consider them the same purpose. Like I said, we've used both of these in the past and you know exactly what they do. So now let's go ahead and get started with our next value, property, which is our align content property. Now, instead of using align items, we're using align content. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. What I'm going to go ahead and say is align content. And before that, let's actually go ahead and give it a little bit more height. I'm going to say maybe 500 pixels. Refresh the page, and obviously these stretch out. We don't have any defined heights for them, but we don't have to worry about that for now. I'll go ahead and change that in just a second. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and start playing around with some of these properties. Now, what's actually really interesting is for our align items, we can actually use both space evenly and space around, but we also have our space between property from our flexbox section. So if I go ahead and try that out now, space between, and refresh the page, you can see what happens is that we have our space between right there, just as we've signified, and it's not spaced evenly. Remember, there's no space before or after our top and bottom items. So that's a really cool feature to keep in mind with our align content property. And of course, along with space evenly and space around, we also have our 3 standard values. Just go ahead and show you that here. Our 3 standard values, which are center, start, and end. So I can go ahead and show you that now. Align content to the end, and that will push everything down to the bottom of the page. So there we go. There's a lot to digest in this video. There's a lot of different properties to cover and memorize, but don't worry about all of that. For now, just understand which property does which, and everything will just fall naturally into place. And remember, if you ever forget how to do something, you can always go and both review the lectures or just Google it. It's really that simple. There are tons of articles and helpful resources out there to help you decide or figure out some of the properties you may have lost or forgotten in your time using CSS. So there we go. That's pretty much it for aligning content. It's quite easy in terms of properties, although there are a lot of values. Once you start using them and getting used to some of the subtle differences, everything will just fall naturally into place, as I said before. All right, let's move on.